Dr. Olowo-Ake joins us this morning. He's an analyst on geopolitical and international policy. Thanks for joining us this morning, Dr. Olowo-Ake.
Thank you for having me.
One question straight up. What exactly is happening between Israel, the U.S., and Iran?
Well, I'll answer that by saying that, first of all, some will attribute what is currently happening to be the unfinished business of the 12-day war, which took place in 2025. Others would say that what is playing out now is actually the end product of the long-standing desire by the United States, and especially also by Israel, to change the administration in power in Iran. That is the theocratic government that is in power, with the Ayatollahs always providing the head of state, to administer Iran. So I think these two perspectives would give a background to what is happening. But of course, in reality or in definitive terms, what we are witnessing at the moment is an international armed conflict between the United States and Israel on the one hand, against the regime in Iran.
If this is just about, you talked about theocracy, but there are those who will look back in time and wonder, first of all, the U.S. had always been, particularly dating back to the days of President Carter, I think, the U.S. played some role in the nationhood of Israel to a certain extent. And now, very fantastic friends have become sworn enemies, so to speak. What happened? And how do you see this whole escalation going? Do you see de-escalation, or what exactly do you expect?
Okay, I thought you meant to say the relationship between the United States and Iran has gone bad. Yes, truly, there was a time when Iran was actually, or could be considered to have been, I would say even more than an ally, to have been like a proxy of the United States. This was when the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was the monarch in charge of Iran. But of course, in 1979, there was a revolution which was holistic, which was massive, and which had as its arrowhead Ayatollah. I'm trying to recall the name now, but Ayatollah Khamenei, who came into power from exile in Paris, and then, of course, instituted the theocratic administration that we have in Iran today. And with the advent of the Ayatollah's government, the policy and foreign policy direction of Iran changed completely. It was no longer pro-West.
Okay. Well, let's hope we'll get that back, because, Chamberlain, there are so many, issues to raise about this. On the one hand, part of the conversation. Okay, well, Dr. Olowo-Ake, we lost you for a bit. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I was saying that with Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, Iran tried to fill the gap, in my opinion, that had been created by the departure of Egypt as a leader of the Arab Muslim world, to speak. Although Iran is not Arab, Iran is Persian. And so we saw a foreign policy which brought to the fore the rights, for example, of the Palestinian people, and that sought to challenge Israeli incursions at premeditated intervals into Lebanon, into the politics of Lebanon, and subsequent leaders in Iran have maintained this position. The only addition to those two foreign policy agenda perhaps would be that they have also brought in Yemen into the equation following the intervention of Saudi Arabia in Yemen against the Houthis. The Iranians backed the Houthis and gave the Houthis the capacity to be able to dominate most parts of Yemen and, of course, to dominate the adjacent contiguous territorial waters. So this has created a big strategic shift in the entire power spectrum or power configuration spectrum in that region, which is not acceptable to Israel and not acceptable to the United States.
Would you say is at the crux of this? One of the issues that Israel had raised consistently is that Iran's nuclear ambitions represent what they call an existential threat. So, and if much of the tension centers on Iran's nuclear program, how realistic from a diplomatic perspective would you say is the possibility of reviving negotiations that are similar to the agreement reached in 2015 or thereabouts?
I think the chances of reaching such an agreement has been overtaken by reality, because obviously we are now in the phase in which war has replaced politics. You know, so and I really think it would be very difficult to go back to the negotiation table. In fact, we've had Ali Larijani, who was the lead negotiator for Iran, just about, I think, 72 hours ago, saying they are not going back to negotiation. They want to see the military dimension pursued to a certain level based on their own projections, and only then will they think of going back to negotiation. And their argument is that this war is imposed on them. They didn't start the war. President Trump, on the other hand, even as recently as yesterday, has been indicating that he's looking forward to going back to negotiation. So on both sides, you know, for the Israelis, they don't even want any sort of agreement at all. They believe there must be a military solution, and the regime in Iran should be uprooted, and a new political administration created in Iran. So I think we're in a difficult phase at the moment, because the war has, of course, broken out, and we have seen all kinds of targets being hit. We've seen the impact on the global economy, and rather than de-escalating, states that could actually be playing a role in trying to whittle down the rhetoric and the tensions are themselves queuing up to take sides. So it is not looking good.
And that's rather concerning. Let me bring this a little closer home. Nigeria is one of about 127 or thereabouts states in the non-aligned movement, and as far as they are concerned, they are not aligning with any superpower, so to speak. How far do you see Nigeria holding up on that one? And if Nigeria or Nigerians will be taking any position, what would be your counsel? What would be what's the caution that the federal government has to take, both from a diplomatic and a foreign affairs perspective, and what should Nigerians themselves be saying wherever they are?
Well, the non-aligned movement has not been as strong as it was in the days of the Cold War. I think the end of the Cold War in 1989, with the introduction of perestroika and glasnost, that is openness and change in Russian, by former Secretary General of the Communist Party, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the last leader of the Soviet Union. At that time, at the end of the Cold War, apparently the founders or those who are in the non-aligned movement thought that it would no longer be needed, because the conditions precedent on it being formed, that is a massive rivalry between the then Soviet Union and the United States, no longer existed. But of course, in recent time, given the dynamics in the international system, attempts have been made to bring back the non-aligned movement. But I don't think, in my view, that it is as effective as it was, or that it could still be as effective as it was in the era of the Cold War. Now, coming to what Nigeria ought to be doing, given the reality in the international system today.
And that's a really crucial point to come in, Chamberlain.
Oh, all right, Dr. Let me ask you. I mean, it appears a little different perspective and different angles. So, in terms of the end game, what do you think is the end game here? Say, for instance, the U.S. Military containment or military rollback, end of nuclear weapons, or what exactly do you see as the end game here?
For the U.S., and if we go by what some informed analysts have said, who are close to the negotiations between both sides, the U.S. apparently believed that with the decapitation of the leadership of the regime in Iran within the first 24 hours of the war, the U.S. was probably expecting some sort of a fracture in the political system. Some other analysts have said that was, really, really puerile to have that opinion. But this didn't happen, of course, as we know, because Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed. But we have seen that Iran has been able to withstand the pressures, and its military has demonstrated a capacity to deliver on some of the things it promised it would do if it was attacked. So the U.S. is now forced into a situation in which, and if you've had the comments, even trying to ask the Kurdish people, the Kurdish militia, because Iran has a minority Kurdish population, to rise up after having asked the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps to side with the people. That didn't happen. President Trump now asked the Iranian Kurds to rise up. Unfortunately, that has now put Iranian Kurds under fire, because yesterday Iran began bombarding them, both in Iran and in Iraq. So I think the U.S. is in the stage of recalibrating its expectations. And I think it has also been taken completely by surprise, and we have had comments to that effect. So the way out for the U.S. might be, first of all, to check Prime Minister Netanyahu's ambitions of wanting a complete rout of the regime in Iran. And then, of course, based on the threat of Iran this morning, that if the U.S. pursues regime change, they will hit the Israeli nuclear station, the Dimona nuclear facility in the Negev desert. That is a very chilling threat, because we know that from the delivery of ballistic missiles and other missile capabilities that Iran possesses, there are chances that Iran may actually be able to launch missiles at that nuclear facility. That will have catastrophic proportions for everybody. So right now, I think they may have to go to the negotiating table if they consider from intelligence analysis that Iran is actually serious and has the capacity to hit the Dimona nuclear facility. As for the Iranians, I do not know what they meant when Larijani said they would pursue this military objective until they feel satisfied and then they return to the negotiating table. Have they reached that level where they feel satisfied enough to return to the negotiating table? So we do not know what those are, what their parameters are. But I think this is a war everybody agrees cannot be sustained for long because of the negative impact for the entire world. And of course, the environmental challenges that could arise, or environmental catastrophe that could arise if nuclear facilities are targeted, or if, for example, the Americans or the Israelis decide to deploy tactical nuclear weapons against Iran.
Just one more thing before you go. For instance, if those Gulf states that have U.S. presence, if they continue to be targets, do you see this blowing up into a full-scale war in the region?
I don't think so, because if you remember, Chamberlain, at the onset of Iranian attacks on some of those Gulf states, some of them were very angry. Qatar, I think, and Bahrain, even Saudi Arabia, they threatened they would retaliate. But yesterday morning, Mohammed bin Salman the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, became an advocate of peace. He basically started calming down the other Gulf states. And I think that's the rational thing to do because Iran already has nothing to lose. Whereas most of these Gulf states, they still have a lot to lose if they decide to escalate. Already we have seen how the Gulf states that have built themselves into an aviation and a tourism hub have suffered so much in just, I think, estimates of $5 to $6 billion in losses in less than 5 days of war. So I don't think it's in their interest to escalate because the Iranians could actually do more damage. So I think that the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia would also be interested in getting this thing back to the negotiation table.
All right, Dr. Olowo-Ake, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning.
Thank you for having me.